Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This is not simply a story about a drug. It is not a tale of addiction or criminality, though both will haunt every chapter we explore tonight. This is a story about a leaf, a single, unremarkable green leaf that grew quietly in the mountain forests of South America for millions of years, waiting for the moment when human hands would reach out and pluck it from its branches. When they did, when our ancient ancestors first pressed that bitter leaf against their gums and felt the numbness spread, they set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately reshape empires, topple governments, fuel wars, create billionaires, destroy countless lives, and redefine the very concept of human pleasure and pain. This leaf would travel from sacred temples to surgical theaters. It would find its way into the medicine cabinets of Victorian households and the nostrils of Hollywood celebrities. It would fund revolutions and fuel massacres. It would make ordinary farmers into killers and ordinary chemists into gods. The story of cocaine is the story of human ambition, of our endless search for something more, something better, something to take away the pain of existence. It is a mirror held up to civilization itself, reflecting back our greatest achievements and our darkest failures in equal measure. By the time our story reaches the present day, you will understand how a simple jungle leaf became one of the most powerful forces in modern history. You will see how its journey from the misty peaks of the Andes to the streets of every major city on Earth represents something profound about who we are as a species. And perhaps in understanding this history, you will come to see our own time, our own struggles in a different light. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These simple actions help us continue creating content that transforms history into an immersive journey. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what time it is there. I always find it remarkable how many of you tune in from different corners of the world, each of you settling in for this shared experience of learning together. Now, phone away, distractions silenced. Let's begin. In the beginning, there was only the mountain and the mist. High in the cloud forests of what we now call the Andes, a plant was evolving. The Erythroxylum coca species developed its distinctive alkaloids as a defense mechanism against insects, a bitter chemical deterrent that made its leaves unpalatable to the creatures that might otherwise devour them. The plant could not have known, in whatever dim consciousness a plant possesses, that this evolutionary adaptation would one day make it one of the most valuable and dangerous crops on Earth. It simply grew, as plants do, reaching toward the thin Andean sunlight, its roots clinging to the steep mountain slopes, its leaves unfurling in the morning fog. Our story begins in the mist-shrouded valleys of Peru and Bolivia, perhaps 8,000 years from the present day. Picture, if you will, a world utterly different from our own. No cities, no nations, no written language, only small bands of humans moving through a landscape that seemed endless and eternal. These early Andean peoples were remarkable survivors, adapting to one of the most challenging environments on Earth. At altitudes where oxygen is scarce and the cold is relentless, where the terrain is so steep that flat ground is a precious commodity, they carved out an existence that would eventually blossom into great civilizations. Archaeological evidence suggests that coca chewing began in the pre-ceramic period, somewhere between 6,000 and 5,000 BCE. We know this from the marks left on ancient skulls, the distinctive wear patterns on teeth that can only come from decades of holding alkaline substances against the gums. We know this from the lime containers found in burial sites, the small gourds and bone tubes that held the ash or limestone powder that ancient peoples would mix with coca leaves to release the plant's active compounds. These artifacts tell us a story without words, a narrative of daily ritual and sacred practice that stretches back into the prehistoric darkness. The first chapter of this story takes us to these earliest Americans, people whose names we will never know, whose languages have been lost to time. They discovered, through trial and error, through the endless experimentation that marks our species, that this particular plant offered something extraordinary. When the leaves were chewed with a bit of alkaline substance, usually the ash of certain plants or ground limestone, something remarkable happened. The mild bitterness gave way to a gentle numbness. The fatigue of climbing mountain paths seemed to lift. The gnawing hunger that was a constant companion in a world of scarcity seemed to fade into the background. The plant offered relief. But it offered something more than mere physical comfort. From the very beginning, coca was understood to be sacred. It was not simply a useful plant, but a gift from the gods, a divine substance that connected the mortal world to the realm of the spirits. The leaf became central to religious ceremonies, to healing rituals, to the social fabric of Andean life. To chew coca was to participate in something larger than oneself, to join in a tradition that connected one to ancestors stretching back into unimaginable antiquity. The Valdivia culture of coastal Ecuador, flourishing between 3500 and 1800 BCE, left behind ceramic figurines with cheeks bulging, clearly depicting the practice of coca chewing. These small artifacts, recovered from the earth by modern archaeologists, offer us a window into a world almost impossibly remote from our own. The people who created these figurines lived in small villages, fished the abundant Pacific waters, cultivated simple crops. Yet they understood something about coca that their distant descendants would forget, something that the modern world is only now beginning to remember. They understood that coca was not a drug to be feared or abused, but a plant to be respected, a part of the natural world that could serve humanity if approached with wisdom and reverence. As we move forward through the millennia, we encounter increasingly complex societies emerging in the Andean region. The Chavin culture, the Paracas, the Nazca, the Moche. Each of these civilizations left behind evidence of coca use, woven into the very fabric of their existence. The Moche people, who flourished along the northern coast of Peru between 100 and 700 CE, created elaborate pottery depicting coca chewing in both mundane and ceremonial contexts. Their ceramic vessels show figures with the distinctive bulging cheek, the small gourd of lime held delicately in hand. These images tell us that coca was everywhere in Moche society, from the fishing villages along the coast to the temple complexes where priests communicated with the divine. But it was the Inca Empire that would elevate coca to its highest status, transforming it from a widely used plant into a symbol of imperial power and divine authority. The Inca, rising to dominance in the 15th century CE, created one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Their realm stretched from the equatorial forests of Ecuador to the arid plains of Chile, encompassing deserts, mountains, and jungles, binding together dozens of ethnic groups and millions of people under a single administrative system. And at the heart of this vast enterprise was the coca leaf. The Inca understood coca as a gift from Inti, the sun god, transmitted to humanity through Mama Coca, the goddess of health and joy. According to Inca mythology, the first coca bush grew from the body of a beautiful woman who had been executed for adultery. Her remains were divided and buried in different places, and wherever they lay, the sacred coca plant would spring forth. This origin story, with its themes of sacrifice, transformation, and divine generosity, reveals how deeply coca was embedded in Inca spiritual life. The leaf was not merely useful, it was holy. Under Inca rule, coca cultivation was closely controlled by the state. The most prized coca came from specific valleys in what is now Bolivia and Peru, regions where the climate and soil produced leaves of exceptional quality. These imperial coca plantations were worked by specialized laborers, and the harvest was carefully regulated. While common people could access coca for everyday use, the finest leaves were reserved for the nobility, for religious ceremonies, and for the emperor himself, the divine Sapa Inca, who sat at the apex of this vast hierarchical society. Coca leaves were offered to the gods at temples throughout the empire. They were burned as sacrifices, their fragrant smoke rising toward heaven. They were placed with the dead, provisions for the journey to the afterlife. They were exchanged as gifts, sealing alliances and cementing relationships. The leaf bound together the spiritual and material realms, connecting the Inca to their gods and to each other in a web of sacred obligation. But coca also served more practical purposes. The Inca Empire depended on human labor, on the tireless work of millions of subjects who built roads, farmed fields, constructed temples, and fought wars. Coca made this labor possible. At the high altitudes where the Inca built their mountain cities, where the air was thin and the cold was constant, coca provided the energy that human bodies needed to function. The famous chasquis, the relay runners who carried messages across the empire at astonishing speed, relied on coca to maintain their pace. A message could travel from Quito to Cusco, a distance of some 1,200 miles, in just 5 days, each runner sprinting through the mountains with a quid of coca leaves tucked into his cheek. However, we must be careful not to romanticize this history. The Inca Empire, like all empires, was built on coercion and control. The workers in the coca plantations, the runners on the mountain roads, the soldiers in the imperial armies did not always labor willingly. Coca helped make possible a system of exploitation as much as a system of achievement. The leaf that brought comfort also facilitated control. This ambiguity, this dual nature of coca as both blessing and burden, would persist throughout its long history. The second chapter of this story reveals how everything changed in the 16th century when strangers from across the sea arrived on Andean shores. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire, beginning with Francisco Pizarro's landing in 1532, represents one of the most dramatic and devastating events in human history. A civilization that had stood for centuries, that had built cities in the clouds and roads across impossible terrain, was brought crashing down by a few hundred men with horses, steel, and guns. And with the Inca fell the old order of coca, though the leaf itself would prove more resilient than the empire that had once controlled it. The Spanish conquistadors and the priests who followed them initially viewed coca with deep suspicion.
Here was a plant central to the religious practices of a people they considered pagans, a substance used in rituals that offended Christian sensibilities. In 1551, the Council of Lima, the governing body of the Catholic Church in Spanish Peru, condemned coca as something worthless and fit for the misuse and superstition of the Indians. The Bishop of Cusco went further, calling it an illusion of the devil. For a time, it seemed that the conquest would bring an end to the ancient tradition of coca use. But economics, as so often happens, trumped ideology. The Spanish conquistadors and the priests who followed them had come to the Americas seeking wealth, and they found it in abundance in the silver mines of Potosi. This mountain of silver in what is now Bolivia became the engine of the Spanish colonial economy, producing vast quantities of precious metal that flowed back across the Atlantic to finance Spain's wars and ambitions. But mining silver was brutal, dangerous work carried out at altitudes exceeding 13,000 feet in tunnels where the air was poisonous and cave-ins were common. Indigenous workers, forced into labor through the mita system of compulsory service, died by the thousands. The Spanish quickly realized that coca could keep these workers alive and productive. Men who chewed coca could work longer hours in the thin mountain air. They could endure hunger and cold. They could survive, at least for a time, conditions that would otherwise kill them. The same church that had condemned coca as diabolical now found reasons to tolerate it. By the late 16th century, the Spanish colonial authorities had reversed course entirely, not only permitting coca use, but actively encouraging its cultivation and sale. The Spanish even taxed the coca trade, deriving significant revenue from the leaf they had once sought to eradicate. This transformation of coca from sacred plant to labor-enhancing commodity represents a profound shift in its meaning and function. The spiritual dimensions of coca use did not disappear entirely among indigenous peoples, but they were overshadowed by the economic imperatives of colonial exploitation. Coca became a tool for extracting labor and wealth from conquered peoples, a substance that helped make possible one of history's greatest acts of pillage. The silver that flowed from Potosi helped make Spain the dominant power in Europe for a century, but it came at a cost measured in millions of indigenous lives.
Meanwhile, in Europe, coca was largely unknown. The leaf did not travel well. It lost its potency during the long sea voyage across the Atlantic. European visitors to the Americas occasionally mentioned the curious native practice of chewing leaves, but their accounts inspired little interest back home. The Spanish physician Nicolás Monardes, writing in 1569, described coca in his influential work on New World plants, noting its ability to suppress hunger and fatigue. But Europe, absorbed in its own concerns, paid little attention. For 3 centuries, coca remained an American phenomenon, its power contained within the Western Hemisphere. But the world was changing. By the 19th century, the age of exploration had given way to the age of science. European chemists, botanists, and physicians were turning their attention to the natural world with new rigor and ambition. They sought to understand the hidden principles that made plants heal or harm, to isolate the active compounds and harness their power. This scientific revolution would transform coca from a foreign curiosity into one of the most significant medical discoveries of the age. Moving into the era of modern chemistry, we encounter the figure of Albert Niemann, a young German doctoral student at the University of Göttingen. In 1859, Niemann achieved what others had attempted but failed to do. Working with coca leaves that had been shipped from Peru, He isolated the primary alkaloid responsible for the plant's effects. He named this white crystalline powder cocaine from the coca plant that yielded it and the chemical suffix used for alkaloids. Niemann described its effects with scientific precision, a bitter taste followed by numbness of the tongue. He had no idea what forces he had unleashed. Niemann died just a year after his discovery, at the age of 26, a victim of a disease that modern medicine might easily have cured. He never saw what became of the substance he had named. But others would take up the study of cocaine with increasing enthusiasm. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, chemists and physicians experimented with the new compound, gradually uncovering its remarkable properties. Cocaine was found to stimulate the nervous system, to enhance energy and concentration, to suppress appetite, and to produce a profound sense of well-being. It was also, critically, a powerful local anesthetic, capable of numbing tissue without causing unconsciousness. What happened next would change everything, as cocaine moved from laboratory curiosity to medical and cultural phenomenon. The key figure in this transformation was Sigmund Freud, the young Viennese physician who would later revolutionize our understanding of the human mind. In 1884, Freud was not yet the father of psychoanalysis. He was a struggling doctor, ambitious but poor, seeking a discovery that would make his reputation. He found it, or he thought he had found it, in cocaine. Freud's essay, Über Coca, published in July 1884, was a paean to the drug's virtues. Drawing on his own experimentation, Freud claimed that cocaine was a safe and effective treatment for depression, digestive disorders, and addiction to morphine and alcohol. He described its effects on himself in glowing terms: increased energy, cheerful mood, enhanced capacity for work. He even sent cocaine to his fiancée, Martha, urging her to take it when she was feeling unwell. Freud saw cocaine as a wonder drug, a breakthrough that would alleviate human suffering and, not incidentally, advance his career. But Freud made a fateful error. Before publishing his paper, he had suggested to a colleague named Karl Koller that cocaine might be useful as an anesthetic in eye surgery. Koller, a young ophthalmologist, pursued this idea with remarkable energy. In September 1884, just weeks after Freud's paper appeared, Koller demonstrated cocaine's effectiveness as a surgical anesthetic at a medical conference in Heidelberg. The news electrified the medical world. For the first time in history, surgeons could operate on conscious patients without causing excruciating pain. The implications were revolutionary. Koller became famous. Freud was left to reflect on his missed opportunity. But Freud's troubles with cocaine were only beginning. He had recommended the drug to a close friend, Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, who was struggling with a morphine addiction. Fleischl-Marxow began using cocaine as a substitute, as Freud had suggested. But instead of curing his addiction, he developed an even more devastating dependency on cocaine, consuming ever larger doses until he was using a full gram per day. He experienced hallucinations, believing that insects were crawling beneath his skin. He deteriorated mentally and physically, dying in 1891, just 7 years after beginning cocaine treatment. Freud quietly distanced himself from his earlier enthusiasm, but the damage was done. Other physicians had taken up his recommendations, prescribing cocaine for all manner of ailments, and they too began to see patients develop the same devastating patterns of addiction and collapse. The wonder drug was revealing its shadow side. Yet even as some medical authorities grew cautious, the commercial exploitation of cocaine was just beginning. We must now turn our attention to a remarkable Italian named Angelo Mariani, who would transform cocaine from a medical treatment into a popular consumer product. Mariani, a chemist with a genius for marketing, developed a wine infused with coca leaf extract. He called it Vin Mariani, and he sold it with a flair that anticipated modern advertising techniques by half a century. Mariani gathered testimonials from the famous and powerful, publishing them in beautifully illustrated albums. Pope Leo XIII, who reportedly drank Vin Mariani to sustain him through long days of papal duties, awarded Mariani a Vatican gold medal and appeared on a poster endorsing the product. Queen Victoria, Thomas Edison, Ulysses S. Grant, and Emile Zola all praised Mariani's creation. The wine became a sensation on both sides of the Atlantic, and Mariani became wealthy beyond his dreams. In the United States, Vin Mariani inspired imitators, including a Georgia pharmacist named John Pemberton. In 1886, Pemberton created a new beverage he called Coca-Cola, originally marketed as a valuable brain tonic containing coca leaf extract and cola nut. The early advertisements promised that Coca-Cola could cure headaches, relieve fatigue, and calm nerves. Though the cocaine content was small and was eventually removed entirely, Coca-Cola's origins reflect the era's casual attitude toward a substance we now recognize as dangerously addictive. How did this happen? How did a drug that was already showing its destructive potential become so widely embraced? The answer lies in the particular circumstances of the late 19th century. This was an age of patent medicines, of unregulated products promising miracle cures for every ailment. Consumers had no way of knowing what was in the tonics and elixirs they purchased, and sellers had every incentive to include addictive substances that would keep customers coming back. Cocaine fit perfectly into this landscape of optimistic quackery. The third chapter of our story reveals how medicine, commerce, and addiction intertwined in increasingly troubling ways. While Freud grappled with the consequences of his recommendations and Mariani counted his profits, other figures were making discoveries that would complicate the story further. Among them was William Halsted, one of the founding fathers of American surgery. Halsted, working at Johns Hopkins Hospital, recognized cocaine's revolutionary potential as a local anesthetic. He developed new techniques for injecting cocaine to block nerve transmission, allowing surgeons to operate on specific regions of the body without general anesthesia. These innovations saved countless lives and remain foundational to modern surgical practice. But Halsted himself became addicted to cocaine through his experiments, injecting himself repeatedly in the course of his research. His colleagues at Johns Hopkins eventually intervened, sending him on a ship voyage to help him recover. He kicked the cocaine habit, but substituted morphine, which he used secretly for the rest of his life. One of the greatest surgeons in American history, a man who transformed medical practice, spent decades hiding a drug addiction from the world. As we approach the turn of the 20th century, we see the first organized efforts to control cocaine use. The optimism of the 1880s had given way to growing alarm. Newspapers reported on cocaine fiends and dope fiends, often in language tinged with racism and xenophobia. In the American South, there were lurid and largely fabricated claims about cocaine use among black workers, stories designed to stoke white fears and justify brutal repression. These racist narratives would shape drug policy for decades to come, contributing to laws that targeted minority communities while largely ignoring the drug use of white middle class. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 represented the first major federal regulation affecting cocaine. It required that products containing cocaine and certain other drugs be labeled, ending the era of secret formulations. Coca-Cola quietly removed the remaining coca extract from its recipe. Patent medicine manufacturers reformulated their products or went out of business, but labeling requirements alone could not stem the tide of addiction. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 went further, imposing strict controls on the distribution of cocaine and opiates. Though framed as a tax measure, the law effectively made it illegal for physicians to prescribe these drugs to addicts, treating addiction as a crime rather than a medical condition. Thousands of doctors were prosecuted. Thousands of addicts were imprisoned. The era of cocaine's legal acceptability had come to an end in America, though the drug itself would never truly disappear. What came next would surprise many observers of the time. After decades as a popular stimulant, cocaine largely fell out of favor during the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. Amphetamines, synthesized in Germany in the 1880s but not widely used until the 20th century, offered similar effects with easier administration. Soldiers on all sides of World War II were issued amphetamines to maintain alertness during long campaigns. The post-war economy ran on amphetamine-fueled productivity. Cocaine, expensive and associated with a disreputable past, became a specialty drug, used by jazz musicians and bohemians, but rarely encountered in mainstream society. While cocaine's visibility faded in the developed world, the coca plant continued its quiet existence in the Andean highlands. In Peru and Bolivia, indigenous peoples maintained their ancient traditions of coca chewing, despite centuries of colonial stigma and periodic attempts at suppression. For them, coca was not a drug to be prohibited, but a food, a medicine, a sacrament woven into daily life. They could not have imagined how dramatically their relationship with coca was about to change. The transformation began in the 1960s and accelerated through the 1970s. We must now examine the social and cultural forces that brought cocaine back to prominence, setting the stage for the devastating epidemic that would follow. As we approach the modern age, we encounter a world in flux. The post-war consensus was crumbling. Young people questioned the values of their parents, experimented with drugs, rejected traditional authority. The counterculture of the 1960s, with its emphasis on consciousness expansion and personal freedom, created new markets for substances that promised altered states and enhanced experiences. Marijuana and LSD captured most of the attention, but cocaine was also finding new audiences. By the early 1970s, cocaine had become the drug of choice for a new cultural elite. It was expensive, glamorous, and associated with success. Unlike the drugs of the counterculture, which promised transcendence and escape, cocaine promised power and achievement. It was a drug for winners, for strivers, for the ambitious professionals of the new economy. Lawyers, stockbrokers, and advertising executives discovered that cocaine could fuel long workdays and longer party nights. Hollywood embraced the drug with particular enthusiasm. It seemed to be everywhere in the film industry, from studio back lots to celebrity parties. This was the era of Studio 54, the legendary New York nightclub where celebrities, artists, and socialites mingled under flashing lights. Cocaine was as much a part of the scene as the music and the dancing. Andy Warhol, Bianca Jagger, Liza Minnelli, they all passed through Studio 54's famous doors, and many partook of the white powder that was openly consumed on the premises. The drug's illegality only added to its allure. Using cocaine was a mark of sophistication, a sign that one had arrived. But while Americans were discovering cocaine's pleasures, something more ominous was developing in South America. The demand for cocaine in the United States and Europe created an economic opportunity that would transform nations and unleash violence on an unprecedented scale. The story now shifts to Colombia, to the men who would build empires of cocaine and blood. Pablo Escobar grew up in Medellin, Colombia, the second largest city in the country, nestled in a valley surrounded by green mountains. Born in 1949, he came from modest origins, his father a farmer, his mother a schoolteacher. By his teenage years, Escobar was already involved in petty crime, stealing tombstones to resell, running small-time smuggling operations. He was ambitious, charismatic, and utterly ruthless, qualities that would serve him well in the business he would soon enter. The cocaine trade in Colombia emerged from a conjunction of circumstances. The country had existing smuggling networks, developed over decades of contraband trade. It had access to coca paste from Peru and Bolivia, which could be processed into cocaine hydrochloride in jungle laboratories. It had entrepreneurs willing to take enormous risks for enormous profits. And it had, in the United States, an insatiable market hungry for product. By the late 1970s, Escobar had risen to become the leading figure in the Medellin cartel, a loose confederation of traffickers who controlled the lion's share of cocaine flowing into the United States. The statistics are almost incomprehensible. At its peak, the Medellin cartel was shipping an estimated 15 tons of cocaine into the United States every day. Escobar's personal fortune was estimated at $30 billion, making him one of the wealthiest people in the world. He owned estates, private zoos, fleets of aircraft, and small armies of sicarios, the assassins who enforced his will through terror. Escobar was not merely a criminal, he was a phenomenon. He built housing for the poor of Medellin, earning him the adoration of thousands who saw him as a benefactor rather than a mass murderer. He constructed soccer fields and playgrounds in impoverished neighborhoods. He was photographed with politicians and celebrities. He even won election to the Colombian Congress, briefly serving as an alternate representative before his criminal activities forced him to resign. The contradictions of his life, the generosity alongside the brutality, the political ambitions alongside the drug trafficking, reveal something profound about the corrupting power of cocaine money. But Escobar's reign was also marked by extraordinary violence. When the Colombian government, under pressure from the United States, attempted to crack down on the drug trade, Escobar responded with war. He ordered the assassinations of presidential candidates, Supreme Court justices, journalists, and police officers. In 1989, his operatives bombed Avianca Flight 203, killing all 107 people on board. They blew up the headquarters of Colombia's intelligence service. They planted car bombs in city centers. Colombia became a war zone, with cocaine at the center of the conflict. The terror reached its peak in the early 1990s. Escobar, facing the threat of extradition to the United States, launched a campaign of violence designed to force the Colombian government to abandon extradition. Bombings and assassinations became almost daily occurrences. The government, exhausted and desperate, eventually agreed to abolish extradition in exchange for Escobar's surrender. He was imprisoned in La Catedral, a facility built to his own specifications, more luxury resort than penitentiary. There, he continued to run his organization, receiving visitors, conducting business, occasionally murdering associates who displeased him. The farce of La Catedral could not last. In July 1992, when the government finally moved to transfer Escobar to a real prison, he escaped, triggering a massive manhunt. For the next 16 months, Colombia's security forces, assisted by American intelligence agencies and a vigilante group called Los Pepes, hunted Escobar through the cities and countryside. On December 2, 1993, they found him in a middle-class neighborhood in Medellin. In the ensuing shootout, Pablo Escobar was killed, shot through the ear as he tried to flee across a rooftop. But the death of Escobar did not end the cocaine trade. It merely dispersed it, breaking the Medellin monopoly into smaller, more numerous operations. The Cali cartel, once secondary to Medellin, rose to prominence. Mexican trafficking organizations, which had previously served as mere transit points for Colombian cocaine, began to take a larger role. The business adapted and evolved, as all businesses do. While the cartel wars raged in Colombia, the United States was experiencing its own cocaine crisis. The emergence of crack cocaine in the mid-1980s transformed the American drug landscape in ways that would reverberate for decades. Crack was simply cocaine processed into a smokable form, a crystalline rock that could be heated and inhaled. The chemical was the same, but the effects were dramatically different. Smoking crack delivered cocaine to the brain far more quickly than snorting powder cocaine, producing an intense but brief high that left users craving more almost immediately. Where powder cocaine had been a drug of the affluent, crack was cheap enough for anyone to afford, at least initially. A single dose could be purchased for as little as $10 or $15, making it accessible to impoverished communities in ways that powder cocaine had never been. The crack epidemic that swept through American cities in the mid-1980s was devastating. Communities that had already suffered from deindustrialization and disinvestment were now ravaged by addiction and the violence that attended the drug trade. Young men, finding few legitimate opportunities, were drawn into dealing crack, which offered income and status that their circumstances otherwise denied them. Gangs proliferated, fighting for control of street corners and housing project stairwells. Murder rates soared. The institutions of community life, already weakened, were further eroded. The human cost was incalculable. Families were torn apart as parents succumbed to addiction, leaving children to be raised by grandparents or surrendered to foster care. Young lives were lost to violence and incarceration. Entire neighborhoods were hollowed out, abandoned by those who could leave, trapped by those who could not. The crack epidemic was not merely a drug crisis, it was a social catastrophe that fell with special weight on Black Americans. The policy response to the crack epidemic has been extensively debated and criticized. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, passed in the emotional aftermath of the death of basketball star Len Bias from a cocaine overdose, established a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Possession of 5 grams of crack carried the same mandatory minimum sentence as possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine. Because crack was more prevalent in Black communities, while powder cocaine was associated with white users, this disparity resulted in dramatically harsher penalties for Black defendants. The law contributed to the mass incarceration of Black Americans, with consequences that persist to this day. Why did the crack epidemic occur? The question has no simple answer. Certainly, the availability of cheap cocaine, processed into an easily used form, was a necessary condition. The social circumstances of urban America in the 1980s, marked by poverty, unemployment, and despair, created fertile ground for addiction. The government's failure to provide adequate treatment and social services left those struggling with addiction without resources, and the political response, focused on punishment rather than public health, made the situation worse rather than better. How did this happen? How did a society as wealthy and powerful as the United States prove so incapable of addressing a public health crisis? The answers are complex, involving race, politics, and economics in ways that we are still struggling to understand. But what is clear is that the crack epidemic was not merely a failure of individuals, it was a failure of systems, of institutions, of the social compact itself. As the 20th century drew to a close, the cocaine trade continued to evolve. The Colombian cartels, weakened by government action and internal conflict, gave way to smaller, more nimble organizations. Mexican trafficking groups, particularly the Sinaloa cartel led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, became increasingly dominant. The roots of the cocaine trade shifted, adapting to enforcement efforts and seeking new points of entry. The business continued, as profitable as ever. In the Andean countries where coca was grown, the situation was equally complex. The United States pressured Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia to eradicate coca cultivation, providing military and economic assistance in exchange for results. These crop eradication programs often fell hardest on small farmers who had little alternative to growing coca in regions where few other crops could generate comparable income. Aerial spraying with herbicides damaged legal crops alongside illegal ones, poisoning the land and angering rural communities. The war on drugs, launched with such confidence in the 1980s, seemed to be making little progress. In Bolivia, the situation took a distinctive turn. In 2006, Evo Morales, a former coca grower and indigenous rights activist, was elected president. Morales distinguished between the coca leaf, which he defended as part of Andean cultural heritage, and cocaine, which he opposed. His government pursued a policy of coca yes, cocaine no, tolerating limited coca cultivation for traditional uses while working to prevent processing into cocaine. This approach remained controversial, criticized by the United States and other countries as insufficiently aggressive. But it represented an attempt to find a middle path between prohibition and permissiveness. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of cocaine's long history. The drug remains widely available despite decades of interdiction efforts. Coca cultivation continues in the Andean countries, with Colombia now the leading producer following a surge in recent years. The trafficking networks have become more sophisticated, using submarines, drones, and encrypted communications to evade detection. The wealth generated by the cocaine trade continues to corrupt governments and fuel violence. The human toll continues as well. Addiction to cocaine, including crack cocaine, remains a significant public health problem in many countries. The communities damaged by the crack epidemic have not fully recovered. The scars of that era remain visible in neighborhoods still struggling with poverty, violence, and distrust of institutions. The criminal justice reforms of recent years, including the reduction of the crack powder sentencing disparity, are steps toward repair, but cannot undo the harm already done. Yet there are also signs of a different approach emerging. Some jurisdictions have moved toward decriminalization of drug use, treating addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal matter. Portugal, which decriminalized all drugs in 2001, has seen significant reductions in HIV infections, overdose deaths, and drug-related crime. Other countries are cautiously experimenting with similar approaches, recognizing that decades of prohibition have not achieved their goals. The medical uses of cocaine, largely abandoned in the 20th century, persist in a limited form. Cocaine remains a Schedule II controlled substance in the United States, meaning it has recognized medical applications despite its potential for abuse. Surgeons occasionally use it as a topical anesthetic, particularly in procedures involving the nose and throat, where its ability to constrict blood vessels is valuable. But these uses are minor compared to the drug's illicit popularity. The coca leaf itself remains controversial. Indigenous communities in Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia continue to value it for its traditional uses as a mild stimulant, an appetite suppressant, a remedy for altitude sickness. Efforts to rehabilitate coca's reputation to distinguish the leaf from the refined drug have met with limited success. The international drug control regime, established in treaties dating to the early 20th century, classifies coca leaf as a controlled substance, placing traditional users in tension with international law. The story of cocaine is far from over. As long as human beings seek pleasure, relief from pain, and escape from the burdens of existence, there will be a market for substances that promise these things. The cocaine trade will continue to adapt, finding new suppliers, new routes, new customers. The struggle between those who traffic in cocaine and those who seek to stop them will continue with no clear end in sight. But perhaps the most important lesson of this history is not about cocaine at all. It is about ourselves, about the choices societies make, about the consequences of those choices. The coca leaf, innocent in itself, became an agent of destruction because of how human beings chose to use it. The medicinal promise of cocaine gave way to commercial exploitation and addiction because profit was allowed to override caution. The crack epidemic devastated communities because society failed to provide alternatives, failed to invest in prevention and treatment, failed to address the underlying conditions that made drugs attractive. The story continues, as all historical stories do, into an uncertain future. The choices we make now will shape what that future looks like. Will we continue to wage a war on drugs that has consumed vast resources while failing to achieve its goals? Will we embrace new approaches, treating addiction as a disease rather than a crime, investing in education and opportunity rather than prisons? Will we find a way to respect traditional cultures while addressing the real harms of addiction? These questions have no easy answers, but they are the questions that the history of cocaine compels us to ask. From the misty mountains of the Andes to the laboratories of 19th century Europe, from the nightclubs of New York to the slums of American cities, from the jungle hideouts of Colombian kingpins to the policy debates of international forums, the story of cocaine illuminates the human condition in all its complexity. As we reflect on this history, we might consider what it teaches us about power and vulnerability, about desire and its consequences, about the ways that substances become entangled with social structures, economic forces, and political choices. The coca leaf that Andean peoples revered for millennia became cocaine, the glamour drug of the disco era, became crack, the destroyer of communities, became the currency of violence in the cocaine wars. These transformations were not inevitable. They were the result of human decisions, each one building on those that came before. And so we return, at the end of our journey, to that leaf still growing on the slopes of the Andes, still holding its bitter alkaloids within its cells. The plant does not know what humans have done with its chemical defenses. It simply grows, as it has grown for millions of years, reaching toward the thin mountain sunlight. The mist rises from the valleys in the morning. The farmers climb the steep paths to tend their crops. The story of cocaine is the story of what happened when one species discovered what another species had created. It is a story of hubris and tragedy, of ambition and destruction, of the endless human search for something more. The night is growing late, and our journey together is nearing its end. We have traveled far, from prehistoric mountain caves to modern city streets, from the laboratories of German chemists to the prisons of American ghettos. We have met emperors and pharmacists, doctors and drug lords, addicts and activists. We have seen how a simple leaf became one of the most powerful forces in modern history. Perhaps you are still awake, listening, pondering the strangeness of this history. Perhaps you have drifted into sleep, the rhythm of these words carrying you into dreams. Either way, the story will be here when you return. History does not disappear when we close our eyes. It waits, patient and vast, for our attention. The coca plant still grows in the mountains. The addicts still struggle in the cities. The traffickers still seek their profits. The reformers still argue for change. The story continues, as all stories do, beyond the boundaries of any single telling. And we, the inheritors of this history, must decide what to do with it. We must choose whether to continue the patterns of the past or to forge new paths. We must ask ourselves what kind of world we want to live in, what kind of relationship we want with the plants and substances that share our planet, what kind of care we owe to those who suffer. These are heavy questions for a sleepy night, but they are the questions that the history of cocaine leaves us with. They are the questions that echo in the silence after the story ends. The mountains are dark now. The mist has settled over the valleys. Somewhere a farmer is sleeping, dreaming of the harvest to come. Somewhere a child is sleeping, knowing nothing of the forces that will shape their future. Somewhere you are sleeping, or nearly so, carried on the current of words toward rest. The story will be here in the morning. It will be here in the weeks and months and years ahead, unfolding as all stories do, shaped by choices not yet made, by people not yet born. The history of cocaine is not finished. It is still being written in the policies we enact, the people we help or abandon, the paths we choose to follow. But for now, let the night enfold you. Let the weight of history become a blanket rather than a burden. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges and choices. Tonight there is rest. The mountains stand silent under the stars. The coca leaves hang still in the windless night. The world turns slowly through the dark hours, carrying us toward dawn. And the story continues.